we're talking about a chest pain that's 68 with some diaphoresis that's dizzy. They're hypertensive, heart rate of 110, and the wife called because he was so sweaty. So Stacy was running us through the differentials that she's thinking about as a paramedic as she's going to this call.
Yes. So on the way to the call, just from chest pain, I would obviously think some type of cardiac event, possible STEMI, MI of some sort, but I might think a PE. And maybe even from you saying sweaty and dizzy, sometimes our BGL patients, our low BGL patients will present that way. Not typical that they would have chest pain, but it's just something I might think about on the way over there.
Awesome. Okay, so on arrival, you're looking at the patient. He looks awful. I know you said you would ask your medic or your EMS partner to do an EKG. And so based on the EKG that was shown that we put on our profile today, what kind of things went through your mind when you saw that?
So first of all, immediately I thought STEMI. Because we have such widespread ST elevation, I noticed that in our precordial leads, we have ST elevation. Some of it's larger than others, but regardless, we definitely have a STEMI going on. Some Q waves in those precordial leads. So maybe it's been going on for a while. This has been a progressive thing. I know at this point, looking at that EKG, we need to get en route to the hospital. And I'm going to go ahead and do code 3. We don't have a code 2 in my location. It's either code 1 or code 3. And this is code 3 worthy. We'll head to the hospital and start our treatments.
What kind of treatments do you think you would start on this patient?
So for this patient, with his blood pressure, I'm not too worried about administering nitro. I would obviously ask allergies. I would ask if there were any ED medications like Viagra, Cialis, rule all of that out. And then I would give a round of nitro and of course aspirin. Same thing, make sure no allergies. And then reassess the pain and manage it with maybe fentanyl or morphine.
Cool. Yeah. And then did you say aspirin too, that you would give aspirin? Okay. Awesome. So when you hand the patient off to me in the emergency department, you probably already, before you've left, you've already probably called in a code STEMI. So from our end, we're looking at activating the cath lab team. We'll make sure that the cardiologist takes a look at that EKG and make sure they do believe it's a STEMI. And then when the patient hits the door, we're getting heparin on board and we're maintaining vitals until we can get them to the cath lab. So then the question kind of becomes, can we access the artery and do PCI? Can we stent them? And sometimes we can't. Sometimes it ends up looking like a LAD like that EKG did, but it ends up being something more, and they end up needing a cabbage. So we hope it's never that, but if it is, we basically just would consult the cardiovascular thoracic team and have them eval for a cabbage to be done later, not emergently. If they can get any stents in, that's great, and hopefully they could. On this patient, they were able to get the LAD, so that was perfect. And then he had a good outcome. Luckily, he didn't have any depressed ejection fraction. And with the LAD, so Stacy, this is interesting. I found that the LAD lesions, they come in hypertensive and tachycardic like this guy. And I think the reason is because when you take the LAD and you basically suffocate that part of the heart, it's going to react with a fight or flight type situation, right? It's going to flood the hormones with like, hey, get me more blood pressure, heart, please go faster, right? We need more oxygen. And it's interesting because the right ventricular infarcts, or the RCA lesions, the inferior wall, they tend to come in low and slow. So oftentimes we can tell, oh, is it going to be an inferior or an anterior based on the vitals? Because if you know that the RCA feeds the sinus node, then it makes sense, right? If you occlude the RCA, you're going to come in with like junctional rhythms or even super Brady. So that's always one thing we think about when we have bradycardia patients. What are we going to do as far as, is it reversible? So for this patient, what's going to end up happening, Stacy, is that he's going to go home on some medications that we call the cardiac happy meal, affectionately. I know, actually my doctor named it that. But basically we send them home on a beta blocker and we start them in the hospital. Beta blocker, this is why you always see that when you pick up patients that have had post-PCI. You see beta blocker. What other medication might you see?
You could see a statin, you could
Yeah,
see a beta blocker, you could see calcium channel blocker.
all the things. Yeah, and so specifically, like they won't let us discharge a patient who's had PCI unless we prescribe a beta blocker. They want metoprolol XL. They want us to have a statin, aspirin, and of course, Plavix or any of the others. For example, Effient or Brilinta. Now, one thing that I would share with EMS folks that are watching, or actually anybody, is that a lot of people don't actually metabolize Plavix. So if you're going on a call and someone has chest pain and they have just been stented, it's possible that their stents are reoccluding even though they were freshly stented, because a lot of times the Plavix, they don't metabolize it. So if that's the case, then of course they're going to fail therapy because it's just going to reocclude. And so we don't do like generalized testing for that, so we won't really know until they come back and they reoccluded their stent. And then we put them on something more superior like Effient or Brilinta. Now, one thing I'll share with your listeners as well is that patients on Brilinta, a lot of them will complain of shortness of breath. About 9% of them experience shortness of breath with that medication. So, but in your mind, right, as a medic, you're probably thinking, oh, well, shortness of breath. I'm going to look for ACS, and you absolutely should. But know that that also can be, if you're not finding anything, that could be from the Brilinta, which is really strange.
That is really interesting. I had never heard that. Okay.
Yeah, because we don't teach paramedics that. Yeah. I want to change that. I mean, all these little fun things, like, why not know these things, you know? Luckily, the gentleman had a good outcome. And one thing that can happen, especially if, can you expand more on that? Absolutely. One thing that can happen before I forget my train of thought is that patients can often, with these LED occlusions, get a depressed ejection fraction. So we may need to support them in the cath lab and balloon pumps or even something more, right, like inotropes. But ultimately, we hope we don't have to do that. And with these LADs, we always get a little nervous. So patient confused says, can you expand more? So Brilinta, number one side effect is shortness of breath, and I haven't seen it resolve with continuing on the medication. So we usually switch them to Effient. And if you've been able to get your patient something other than Plavix, then we're really happy if we can do that. But oftentimes the insurance will just cover Plavix. So we have to go with cost in that case. Effient also is a good drug as well. Stacey, I'm wondering kind of your biggest challenge when you're dealing with chest pain patients as in EMS.
You know, especially when I'm teaching my students, I think sometimes we get in this mindset of this has to be done this way every single time, but every patient presents differently. And so we kind of have to take that into consideration because, okay, yes, I mean, we administer aspirin on every chest pain call, unless there's an allergy or something like that. But for nitro, we have to be very aware of our blood pressure. We have to be very aware of what kind of medications they're already on. And yes, ED medications are a big consideration, but other CNS depressants are also a big consideration as well, especially when they're on that borderline of 100 systolic, 90 systolic. We have to, take that into consideration. One of the other things that I run into is a lot of teachers and students learn to put oxygen on the patient every single time. And I try to break my students of this. As long as they are around 94%, I like to keep the oxygen off of the patient. Just because of the science that's out there that it causes coronary vasoconstriction and can increase the injury to the heart. So oxygen is not always harmless. And that's one of the things that I run into is really treating each patient like they're an individual, not just an algorithm.
I love that so much because it's been a big paradigm shift. When I first started in EMS, it was oxygen on everybody.
Yep.
It was CPAP on everybody. It was like just drive fast on everybody, and that was like the medicine, diesel medicine. And then I also like that you're talking about that you want to treat each patient not as like a recipe,
Yes.
right? It's so cookie cutter, but being patient specific, you can do that as a paramedic, and I think that a lot of people when they're in EMS to kind of get in that cookbook brain because that's what we're taught, and we're not taught to like use our critical thinking skills. So I love that you're teaching the new generation to do that because it's so important. All right, well, Stacey, have a good night. Stay safe.
And I'll see you soon.
Okay,
Okay, see you later.
Bye, everyone.